This is the story of a dark secret buried so deep within the foundations of a powerful American family that its discovery led not to justice, but to annihilation. It is the macabre mystery of the master who bought a broken slave, only to hear his own mother's voice whisper a truth so terrifying it could shatter a man's soul. In the summer of 1851, in Natchez, Mississippi, Samuel Duval, a man of science and immense wealth, was found deceased in his locked study, the victim of a crime with no perpetrator. In one hand, he clutched a receipt for a woman without a past. In the other, a note containing a single chilling sentence. The question that haunted the authorities then, and historians for a century after, was not who killed him, but what impossible truth did he uncover that science itself could not explain, a truth that left him no choice but to erase himself from the world. This case, pieced together from a diary that should have remained buried, reveals how a single, forgotten act of cruelty can echo through generations, returning to demand a payment that is not made in gold or land, but in identity and sanity itself. It is a terrifying tale of a family's hidden crime, a name that was not a name, and a recognition so profound it became a death sentence. We are about to uncover the story of the one debt that could never be paid, only returned. Before we unseal the records of this haunting case, we invite you to become part of our community of historical investigators. Please subscribe to Before the Story and enable all notifications so you never miss an exploration into the archives of the unexplained. If you believe that uncovering these forgotten histories is a vital task, show your support by liking this video. And now let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The story of Samuel Duval's final days would have remained a sanitized footnote in the annals of Natchez high society had it not been for the demolition of the old Adams County Courthouse in the spring of 1958. Sealed within a forgotten cornerstone, a tin box, rusted by more than a century of damp and silence, held a single leather-bound diary. Its pages, though brittle and stained, contained the meticulous, confident script of Samuel Duval, the last master of Briarwood Plantation. The document begins not with family matters or plantation accounts, but with a declaration of purpose, a testament to the cold, intellectual pride that would ultimately become the engine of his own destruction. In an entry dated January 1st, 1851, Samuel outlines the principles of what he termed the Duval method. He saw himself not as a mere slave owner, but as a reformer, a man of science applying enlightened principles to the institution of bondage. He wrote of his experiments in rehabilitation, purchasing so-called defective slaves, those deemed unruly, melancholic, or mentally broken, with the stated goal of restoring their utility and, by extension, their value. He believed, with an unnerving conviction, that no human spirit was so damaged that it could not be remolded through a precise application of psychological conditioning, structured labor, and the undeniable force of a superior will. The diary paints a vivid picture of Briarwood Plantation, not as a place of agricultural production, but as a laboratory. Samuel's world was one of ledgers, timetables, and observational notes, a place where human beings were variables in a grand equation of control. He describes his disdain for the crude brutality of his fellow planters, viewing their methods as inefficient and barbaric. His approach, he insisted, was more profound. It was not about breaking the body, but about systematically deconstructing and rebuilding the mind, a process he chronicled with the detached precision of a botanist studying a strange and exotic plant. This document, hidden for over a century, serves as the only true window into the mind of a man standing on the precipice of an abyss. He was a product of his time and place, a scion of a wealthy Natchez family, whose name carried immense weight in the cotton-rich valleys of Mississippi. His identity was inextricably linked to his lineage, to the grand white columns of Briarwood, and to the unwavering belief in the natural order of his world. It was this absolute certainty, this unshakable faith in his own perception of reality, that made him uniquely vulnerable to the truth that was already making its slow, inexorable journey toward him. The initial pages of the diary are filled with the calm, measured prose of a man utterly convinced of his own genius and righteousness. He details the successes of his method, describing how a supposedly rebellious field hand was transformed into a model of obedience, how a melancholic house servant was cured of her sorrow. Each entry reinforces his self-perception as a benevolent, if stern, architect of human potential. He was not just a master, he was a creator, shaping flawed material into something functional and whole. This belief was the foundation of his entire world, a foundation built on sand, about to be washed away by a tide of history he could not see coming. The diary stands as a stark testament to the psychology of the antebellum elite, a world built on intricate systems of denial and self-justification. Samuel Duval was not an outlier. He was the logical endpoint of a society that had commodified human life and then sought to rationalize the act through the language of science, religion, and progress. His obsession with rehabilitation was not an act of compassion, but the ultimate expression of ownership, the power not just to command a body, but to colonize a mind. He saw no moral contradiction in his work, only the elegant application of theory to practice, an intellectual exercise that would soon become a horrifying existential test. In these early entries, there is no hint of the storm to come, no shadow of the doubt that would eventually consume him. The world of Samuel Duval in January of 1851 was one of order, control, and absolute certainty. He was the master of Briarwood, a respected member of his community, and a man who believed he understood the deepest workings of the human soul. He did not know that his greatest and most terrible education was about to begin, and that the subject of his final, fatal experiment would be himself. The stage was set, the laboratory prepared for the arrival of a single broken woman who would bring his entire world crashing down. The community of Natchez, as described in contemporary accounts, was a place of immense wealth and rigid social stratification, where family honor was paramount and secrets were a currency of power. The Duval name was among the most respected, a symbol of old money and unimpeachable heritage. Samuel, as the sole heir, was the guardian of this legacy, a man entrusted with preserving the family's standing. His diary reveals his acute awareness of this responsibility, a pressure that likely fueled his obsessive need for control and order in all things. It was this very pressure that would make the eventual revelation of his family's buried crime not just a shock, but a fundamental negation of his entire existence. And so, the diary lies open, a voice from a lost world, speaking of a confidence that borders on hubris. It is the calm before the storm, the meticulous record of a man documenting his own descent without realizing he has already taken the first step. The purchase of a single, nameless slave, intended as just another entry in his ledger of successes, would instead become the final entry in the story of Samuel Duval. The mystery of his death begins here, in the quiet, ordered pages of a diary that promised enlightenment but delivered only oblivion. The anomaly first appears in the diary entry for March 12, 1851, recorded with Samuel's typical clinical detachment. He documents the acquisition of Lot 7, a woman purchased from a traveling trader out of New Orleans, a man who specialized in acquiring individuals deemed unsellable at the more public markets. The trader's bill of sale, a copy of which was found folded within the diary's pages, describes the subject as catatonic and without identity, her name listed simply as Rachel, a common placeholder for those whose origins had been deliberately erased. Samuel saw in her the perfect test for his method, a blank slate upon which he could impose order and purpose, the ultimate proof of his theories. In the days following her arrival at Briarwood, Samuel began his methodical process of observation, chronicling her behavior with dispassionate detail. His notes confirmed the trader's description. Rachel was a ghost in human form, a body moving through the world without any apparent connection to it. She did not respond to the overseer's commands, nor to the clang of the dinner bell that structured life on the plantation. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, a study in absolute submission or perhaps absolute absence. The other slaves, Samuel noted, gave her a wide berth, their usual superstitions amplified by her unnerving stillness. The first hint of something inexplicable, the first crack in Samuel's carefully constructed reality, came on the third day. He records it with a tone of scientific curiosity, still attempting to fit the data into his existing framework. While the woman remained unresponsive to everyone else, he noticed that when he spoke directly to her, her head would tilt almost imperceptibly, a minute muscular reaction in the silent landscape of her being. She did not look at him, did not acknowledge his presence in any other way, but her body registered his voice, and his alone. He saw this not as a mystery, but as a triumph. He rationalized this phenomenon in his diary, his prose swelling with self-satisfaction. He wrote that a consciousness so deeply fractured, so lost in the fog of its own trauma, would instinctively recognize and respond to a true, organizing authority. It was, he theorized, a primal response, the broken mind of the slave recognizing the inherent power of the master. He believed he was witnessing the first faint flicker of success, the initial stirrings of a consciousness being drawn out of the abyss by the sheer force of his presence. He was, in his own mind, a healer, a bringer of order to chaos, a restorer of function to that which was broken. This interpretation, however, did not fully account for the growing sense of unease that began to permeate the plantation. The overseer reported that Rachel would not eat unless the food was placed before her by Samuel's own house servant, a man who wore his livery. She would not enter a room unless Samuel himself had recently passed through it. These were not the actions of a person responding to generalized authority, but to a specific personal presence. It was a connection that defied the impersonal logic of his method, hinting at a specificity that he could not yet explain, but which he continued to document with unwavering diligence. The other enslaved people at Briarwood developed their own theories, whispered in the quarters at night, far from the master's ear. They saw the woman not as broken, but as waiting. Her silence was not empty, it was watchful. Her stillness was not catatonia, it was a form of listening, a focused attention directed at one person alone. They believed she was a vessel for something ancient and patient, a spirit that had been called to the plantation for a purpose they could not name, but which they feared with a primal certainty. Their superstitions, which Samuel so readily dismissed, were in fact a more accurate reading of the situation than his own vaunted science. Samuel's diary, however, remained a fortress of rationalism against the rising tide of the uncanny. He meticulously recorded each anomalous behavior, each strange report from his staff, but always framed it within the language of his experiment. The woman's selective responses were subject fixation, a common stage in psychological recovery. The other slave's fear was folkloric contamination, the predictable reaction of uneducated minds to a phenomenon they could not understand. He was a scientist observing a chemical reaction, unaware that the chemicals were about to become explosive. But the objective tone of the diary begins to falter, almost imperceptibly at first. Between the lines of his confident analysis, a new note of something akin to frustration or perhaps confusion begins to creep in. He writes of the woman's unusual resistance to baseline stimuli, a clinical phrase that barely conceals the fact that she was not responding as his theories predicted. He was the conductor of this orchestra, yet one instrument refused to play for anyone but him, and then only in a key he did not recognize. The experiment was continuing, but the question of who was truly in control was becoming increasingly and unnervingly ambiguous. The final entry of this period, dated late April, captures this dawning uncertainty. He describes an incident where he dropped a book while walking across the main lawn. Rachel, standing nearly 50 yards away, began walking toward it, her movements slow and deliberate, as if summoned. She stopped just short of the book, waiting. When he bent to retrieve it, she turned and walked away. He wrote, "It is as if she anticipates my needs before I'm fully aware of them myself. This suggests a level of cognitive connection that is, at present, inexplicable." The first true crack in his certainty had appeared, a fissure through which a terrifying truth would soon emerge. Throughout the spring of 1851, the unsettling atmosphere at Briarwood intensified, a slow, creeping dread that Samuel Duval continued to document with a hand that was becoming discernibly less steady. Rachel's strange, selective consciousness began to manifest in ways that were increasingly difficult to rationalize. His diary entries from this period transform from the confident notes of a scientist to the troubled chronicle of a man haunted by his own experiment. He recorded that her silence was no longer passive. It had acquired a palpable weight, an active presence that seemed to absorb the sounds around it. The grand house, once a symbol of his control, grew unnervingly quiet in her presence. The first truly disturbing pattern he noted was her gaze. She still refused to meet his eyes directly, but she began to follow his movements with an unnerving, peripheral focus. From the far side of a field, from an upstairs window, from the deep shadows of the veranda, he would catch a glimpse of her, a still figure whose entire being seemed oriented toward him. It was not the subservient watchfulness of a slave awaiting orders, but the predatory stillness of a hunter observing its prey. His diary entry for May 10th reads, "I am constantly aware of being observed. It is a sensation that is beginning to disrupt my concentration." The other house servants, whose superstitions Samuel had once derided, now became his primary source of data on a phenomenon he could no longer ignore. They reported that Rachel had begun to hum, a low, monotonous sound with no discernible melody, a dirge-like drone that seemed to emanate from deep within her chest. They claimed the humming was most prominent at night, and that it called the dead, for on the nights she hummed, the dogs in the kennels would whine and refuse to leave their enclosures. The overseer, a man not given to flights of fancy, confirmed the reports, adding that the sound made the hair on his arms stand on end. Samuel's attempts to frame these events in scientific terms grew more strained. He described the humming as primitive vocalization, a potential sign of regressive memory recovery. The other slave's fear he labeled mass hysteria, a psychological contagion sparked by the presence of an unknown variable. Yet his carefully constructed rationalizations were beginning to crumble under the weight of direct experience. He himself had begun to hear the humming, a faint resonant vibration that seemed to travel through the very walls of the house, a sound he could feel in his bones long before his ears could properly detect it. The most terrifying incident of this period, and the one that marked a significant shift in his psychological state, occurred on a moonless night in late May. He recorded it in a long, rambling entry, the script almost illegible in its haste. He had been working late in his study when a sudden sense of unease compelled him to look out the window. There, on the lawn below, stood Rachel, her white shift almost invisible against the darkness, her head tilted up toward his window. She was not humming. She was perfectly still, simply watching. He wrote that he felt not fear, but a profound and inexplicable sense of being recognized, of being seen in a way that stripped away his status as master and left him utterly exposed. This event shattered his clinical detachment. The diary entries that follow are filled with a new, paranoid energy. He began to question the source of the woman's knowledge. How did she always seem to know where he was, what he was doing? He started to conduct counter-experiments, changing his daily routine, approaching his study from different directions, but she was always there, a silent, knowing presence at the edge of his perception. The feeling of being the observer had completely inverted. He was now the specimen under the microscope, his every move scrutinized by an intelligence he could not comprehend. The social fabric of the plantation was also beginning to fray. The overseer reported that work in the fields had slowed, that the other slaves were becoming sullen and uncooperative. They would fall silent whenever Samuel approached, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something he could not name, but which felt like pity. They knew something he did not, possessed a key to the mystery that was unfolding, but they would not share it. Briarwood was no longer his kingdom of order. It was a place of whispers, shadows, and a suffocating, unspoken truth. This accumulation of anomalies pushed Samuel to the breaking point. The world, as he understood it, was governed by logic, by cause and effect, by the clear and immutable lines of social hierarchy. What was happening at Briarwood defied all of these principles. It was a slow, systematic dismantling of his reality, an assault on the very foundations of his identity. He was a man of science, yet he was living in a ghost story. He was the master, yet he was losing control. The pressure was building, forcing him toward a confrontation he did not know he was prepared for. The final diary entry before the cataclysmic revelation is a portrait of a man on the verge of collapse. He wrote, "The silence in this house has a voice. The woman is its mouth. I must force it to speak. I must understand the nature of the logic that governs this madness, or it will surely consume me." He had resolved to force a direct interaction, to break through her silence and demand an explanation. He believed he was taking back control of his experiment. In reality, he was walking willingly into the heart of the trap that had been laid for him since the day he was born. The confrontation is recorded in a frantic, ink-blotched diary entry dated June 3rd, 1851. Samuel, driven by his need for a logical explanation, decided to force the issue. He describes the scene with the heightened, almost hallucinatory clarity of a man in the grip of obsession. He summoned Rachel to the main parlor, a room of opulent furniture and suffocating formality, a room that symbolized the very heart of his authority. She entered as she always did, a specter in a simple cotton dress, her eyes fixed on the floor. He stood before her, the diary entry conveying his mounting desperation, and issued a direct command. "Speak my name." For what he describes as an eternity, there was only silence, a void so profound it seemed to drink the very air from the room. He repeated the command, his voice sharper, edged with an authority that was beginning to sound like pleading. And then it happened. Slowly, as if lifting a great weight, the woman raised her head. For the first time since her arrival at Briarwood, she looked directly at him. Her eyes, he wrote, were not empty or broken, but filled with an ancient, bottomless sorrow. Her lips, dry and cracked from disuse, parted. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping whisper, a sound like dead leaves skittering across stone. She did not say, "Master Duval." She did not say, "Master Samuel." She uttered a single word, a name from a life he had almost forgotten, a sound that belonged to the ghost of a memory. She said, "Sammy." The diary entry captures the moment of impact, the sound of a world breaking. He wrote that the name struck him with the physical force of a blow, that it bypassed his ears and detonated deep within his soul. It was a name that had not been spoken aloud in over 2 decades, a private, sacred relic from his early childhood, a name used by one person and one person only, his mother, who had died of a fever when he was 10 years old. The rest of the diary entry is a chaotic torrent of rationalization, a desperate attempt to shore up the collapsing walls of his reality. He seized upon the most logical, if improbable, explanation. This woman, Rachel, must have at some point been owned by a neighboring family. She must have been a house servant, perhaps, in the days before his mother's death. She must have overheard his mother calling him by that name, and the sound, buried deep in her fractured memory, had been jarred loose by his command. It was a flimsy, threadbare theory, but it was the only thing standing between him and the chasm of an unthinkable alternative. He clung to this hypothesis with the ferocity of a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. He wrote of his intention to immediately consult the property records of the surrounding plantations, to search for any transaction that might place this woman in the vicinity of Briarwood 20 years prior. He framed it as a scientific inquiry, a logical next step in his investigation. "There must be a record," he wrote, the words underlined 3 times. "A rational explanation is the only acceptable outcome." The entry reveals a man not just seeking an answer, but desperately needing a specific kind of answer, one that would allow his world to remain intact. But the seed of the impossible had been planted. His own words betray the insufficiency of his theory. He describes the way she spoke the name, not as a recalled sound, but with an intimacy, a familiarity, a sense of ownership that chilled him to the bone. It was not the voice of someone who had overheard a name, it was the voice of someone who had created it. He tried to dismiss this feeling as a subjective, emotional reaction, a contamination of his scientific objectivity. But the feeling lingered, a cold, hard knot of dread in the pit of his stomach. The social contract between master and slave, the very foundation of his identity, had been irrevocably breached. In that single moment of recognition, she had ceased to be Lot 7, the broken object of his experiment. She had become a person with a past that was inexplicably, impossibly entangled with his own. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. She, the silent and powerless one, now possessed a piece of his history that he himself did not understand, a key to a door in his own mind that he did not know existed. The parlor, once a symbol of his power, had become the scene of his spiritual undoing. He was no longer the master in control, but a child who had just heard a ghost speak his name. The woman, having delivered her single devastating word, had lowered her gaze once more, resuming her mask of silent catatonia. But the act was done. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening roar of a question that he was now compelled to answer, no matter how terrifying the destination to which it might lead him. The diary entry concludes with a chilling premonition. "I have a distinct and unwelcome feeling," he wrote, "that in my search for the origin of her memory, I will uncover more than I have bargained for. It is as if by asking her to speak, I have given a voice to a secret that has been waiting a very long time to be told." He believed he was setting out to solve the mystery of her past. He did not yet comprehend that he was, in fact, embarking on a journey to uncover the true, horrific mystery of his own. Samuel Duval's obsession, ignited by that single whispered name, began to consume him utterly, and in doing so, to sever him from the world he had once commanded. The diary entries from the weeks that followed document not just a private investigation, but the rapid decay of his social standing and the fracturing of the rigid order at Briarwood. His quest for a rational explanation became a mania, isolating him from his peers, his staff, and ultimately from his own carefully constructed identity. He had entered a labyrinth of his own making, and the walls were closing in. His first action was to bar all visitors from the plantation. The diary records his justification with a paranoid, defensive tone. He wrote that his research required absolute concentration, free from the meaningless social obligations of Natchez society. He declined invitations to dinners, to cotton auctions, to the Sunday services that were the bedrock of community life. He sent letters pleading illness or pressing business, excuses that his fellow planters, a class of men keenly attuned to any sign of weakness or eccentricity, soon began to see through. Briarwood, once a hub of social activity, became a fortress of silence. The fracture within the plantation itself was even more severe. Samuel, who had once prided himself on his enlightened management, abandoned all pretense of running his estate. He spent his days locked in his study with old maps and property deeds, and his nights pacing the long, dark corridors of the house. The overseer, a practical man named Miller, found himself managing a rudderless ship. He reported to Samuel, as documented in a terse diary entry, that the other planters were beginning to talk, that rumors were spreading of madness at Briarwood. The entry for June 15th details a direct confrontation with Miller. The overseer warned him that the other slaves were becoming unmanageable, their work slowing, their mood bordering on insubordinate. "They are whispering, sir," Samuel records Miller as saying. "They say the woman has put a curse on this house, and on you." Samuel's response, as he documents it, was one of furious dismissal. He accused Miller of being infected by the same primitive superstitions as the field hands, and threatened his dismissal if he ever spoke of the matter again. The conversation marked the beginning of his total alienation from his own staff. He was now a man alone, trapped in a house with the source of his torment. The other slaves who had once feared him now seemed to watch him with a kind of knowing pity. He wrote of catching their glances, of hearing their whispers fall silent as he entered a room. They possessed a truth he was desperately seeking, but their silence was a wall he could not breach. They had formed a silent, protective circle around Rachel, not out of love for her, but out of a shared, instinctual understanding that the truth she represented was a power too dangerous to be spoken aloud. The diary reveals his growing paranoia. He began to suspect his neighbors of conspiring against him, of wanting to see him fail so they could purchase his lands at a discount. He wrote of seeing shadows moving at the edge of his property at night, of hearing voices on the wind. His scientific rationalism had completely given way to a siege mentality. He was a king in a besieged castle. And the enemy was not just outside the walls, but inside his own mind, in the echo of a name he could not explain. This social and psychological collapse was not lost on the broader community. A letter from a neighboring plantation mistress, dated June 20th and preserved in the Mississippi State Archives, speaks of the strange and troubling business at Briarwood. She writes, "Mr. Duval has not been seen in town for weeks, and they say he has turned his home into a veritable prison. There is talk of a new slave, a conjure woman, who has bewitched him." The gossip, once confined to the slave quarters, had breached the walls of the plantation and was now spreading through the parlors of Natchez. Samuel was aware of his fall from grace, but his diary shows he was powerless to stop it. His obsession had its own gravitational pull, dragging him further and further away from the life he had known. He wrote, "Let them talk. Let them whisper. They see only the surface of things, the ramblings of a man they think is mad. They do not understand that I am on the verge of a discovery that will rewrite the very laws of memory and identity. I am sacrificing my reputation for a truth that is far more valuable." He had reframed his isolation not as a symptom of madness, but as the necessary price of genius. The social fracture was now complete. He was an outcast in his own community, a stranger in his own home, a master who no longer commanded the respect or fear of his own slaves. He had sacrificed everything for his quest, a quest that had begun as a scientific inquiry and had become a desperate personal exorcism. He was alone with his books, his records, and the silent woman whose existence was a riddle he had to solve, even if the answer was destined to destroy him. The silence of Briarwood was now the silence of a tomb, waiting for its final occupant. Having exhausted the records of his neighbors and found no trace of Rachel's past, Samuel Duval, in a final desperate gambit, turned his investigation inward. He retreated to his father's old study, a room he had left largely untouched since Elias Duval's death years earlier, a masculine sanctuary of leather-bound books, hunting trophies, and the lingering scent of tobacco. It was here, surrounded by the artifacts of the man he had revered, that he would unearth the first piece of the irrefutable, soul-destroying truth. His diary entry from this period, written over several days, reads like the chronicle of an archaeological dig into his own family's ruin. He began with the plantation ledgers, massive dust-covered volumes that recorded every transaction, every birth, and every death at Briarwood for the past 50 years. He was searching for a single specific record, the sale of a female slave to a neighboring estate in the late 1820s, a transaction that would confirm his desperate hypothesis. He spent 2 days poring over the meticulous, spidery script of his father's bookkeeper, his hope dwindling with every page he turned. There was no such sale. The records were perfect, unbroken. No slave had been sold to a neighbor. The discovery, when it came, was not the one he was looking for. It was an anomaly, a single line in a ledger from the autumn of 1828 that stood out for its brutal brevity. It recorded the sale of a 16-year-old girl named Eliza to a man known only as J. Marchant, a notorious slave trader who operated out of the New Orleans markets, a man known for making troublesome individuals disappear into the brutal sugar plantations of the Deep South. The reason for the sale, a column that usually detailed age or infirmity, contained a single damning word: insubordination. The name Eliza struck him first. It was not a common name among the enslaved at Briarwood, but it was a name that held a sacred place in his own history. It was the name of his mother. His diary entry for that night is a single, chilling sentence, scrawled in a shaky hand. The name of my mother was also Eliza. A coincidence, he tried to tell himself, a cruel trick of fate. But he knew with a certainty that defied all reason that it was not. He had seen the name Eliza in the slave registries before. She had been his mother's personal handmaiden, a girl who had come to the plantation as part of his mother's dowry. The impact of this discovery, as he documents it, was immediate and devastating. The carefully constructed image of his father as a benevolent, if stern, patriarch began to crumble. Pious Elias Duval, a man who spoke of the master's duty to his people, had sold a 16-year-old girl, his own wife's attendant, to a man like Marchant. The act was one of exceptional cruelty, a punishment reserved for the most serious of transgressions. The word insubordination seemed a wholly inadequate explanation for such a final and brutal act. What could this girl have possibly done to warrant such a fate? He describes in his diary how he sat in his father's chair for hours, the ledger open before him, the single entry seeming to burn on the page. The silence of the house, which had once been merely unsettling, now felt accusatory. He felt the weight of a crime he did not understand, a sin whose shape was still hidden in the shadows of the past. The rational, scientific mind that had set out to solve the riddle of Rachel was now confronted with a moral horror that defied all of his carefully constructed theories. This was not about a flaw in a slave. This was about a rot at the very heart of his own family. The revelation recontextualized everything he had experienced in the preceding weeks. Rachel's strange connection to him, her silence, her sorrowful eyes, it all began to align in a new and terrifying pattern. He was no longer looking for a forgotten memory in a broken mind. He was now searching for the truth of a crime committed by his own father, a crime whose only living witness was the silent woman who now walked the halls of his home. The nature of his quest had changed. It was no longer an intellectual puzzle. It was a moral imperative. This first piece of irrefutable evidence did not solve the mystery. It deepened it into something far darker. The question was no longer, where did she hear my name, but who is Eliza, and why was she cast out? The diary entries become frantic, filled with hypotheses and crossed-out theories. He speculated that perhaps Eliza had attacked his mother, or had been caught stealing, or had attempted to flee. But none of these common plantation crimes seemed to fit the sheer finality of the punishment. Selling a girl to Marchant was not a correction. It was an erasure. The psychological impact on Samuel was profound. The man who had set out to rehabilitate the broken was now beginning to feel himself breaking. The certainties that had defined his life, the honor of his family, the benevolence of his father, the righteousness of his own position, were all being systematically dismantled. He wrote, "I feel as if I am a stranger in my own home, the heir to a history I do not know. This house is built on a lie, and I am beginning to fear that I am the final expression of it." The foundation had cracked, and he was beginning his long, slow fall into the abyss below. The authority that collapsed in the wake of the ledger's revelation was not that of the state or the church, but something far more fundamental to Samuel Duval's world, the moral authority of his father. Elias Duval, the man he had revered, the man whose portrait still hung in the main hall, a symbol of Southern virtue and patriarchal strength, was now recast in Samuel's mind as a figure of profound hypocrisy and hidden cruelty. This collapse, documented in the diary, was not just the disillusionment of a son. It was the disintegration of the central pillar supporting Samuel's entire identity. Driven by a new and terrible urgency, Samuel forced the lock on his father's old correspondence box, a rosewood chest that had remained sealed since his death. He was no longer searching for a record. He was searching for a motive, for the reason behind the monstrous act recorded in the ledger. Inside, beneath bundles of business letters and cotton receipts, he found a small, tied packet of personal correspondence. The letters were from his father to the family lawyer, a man named Alistair Finch, and in a letter dated the week after Eliza's sale, he found the answer he was looking for, an answer far more depraved than he could have imagined. Elias Duval wrote not of insubordination or theft, but of a moral stain upon his household. He spoke of the necessity of removing the girl Eliza from the estate to prevent a permanent stain upon the family honor, as she has proven fruitful in her sin. The euphemism was unmistakable, a common coded language among planters of the era. The girl had become pregnant, and given the context, a 16-year-old handmaiden in a house ruled by an absolute patriarch, the identity of the father was a horrifying certainty. His own father had violated his mother's servant and then sold her and his unborn child away to preserve his reputation. Samuel's diary entry for that night is a raw, visceral cry of anguish and disgust. He describes the physical revulsion he felt holding the letter, the sense that the very paper was contaminated by the sin it described. The image of his pious, church-going father was replaced by that of a predator, a man who had committed a profound act of personal and spiritual violence and then concealed it with a single, brutal business transaction. The authority of the name Duval, a name he had carried with such pride, was now irrevocably tarnished, drenched in a hypocrisy so deep it seemed to poison the very air he breathed. This revelation, however, only solved part of the puzzle. It explained the crime, but it did not fully explain Rachel. Samuel's mind, still clinging to a semblance of logic, formulated a new, even more disturbing hypothesis. If his father had sold Eliza away while she was pregnant, then he, Samuel, had a half-sibling, a brother or sister born into the brutal hell of the New Orleans slave markets, a life of unimaginable suffering. Was it possible that Rachel was not Eliza herself, but the daughter of Eliza, his own half-sister, returned by some cruel twist of fate to the house of her father? The collapse of his father's authority had a cascading effect on his perception of his own. His Duval method, his vaunted experiments in rehabilitation, now seemed like a grotesque parody of his father's sins. He had brought this woman to Briarwood to remold her, to impose his will upon her broken mind, an act of intellectual violation that now felt like a pale echo of the physical violation his father had committed. He wrote, "I sought to control her mind, just as he controlled her body. The sin is the same, merely expressed in a different language. I am my father's son in ways I never knew." The weight of this inherited guilt was crushing. He was the beneficiary of the crime, the master of the house that had been purified by Eliza's banishment. The wealth he commanded, the power he wielded, the very name he bore, it was all built upon this foundation of silent, brutal exploitation. The authority he had once taken for granted now felt like a costume, a mask, hiding a history of profound moral corruption. He could no longer walk the halls of Briarwood without seeing the ghost of that 16-year-old girl, without feeling the weight of her stolen future. This internal collapse was mirrored by a final, desperate act of defiance against his father's memory. He describes in his diary how he took the grand portrait of Elias Duval from its place of honor in the main hall and carried it out into the night. He did not burn it. He took it to the old, disused well at the edge of the property and dropped it into the darkness, listening as it struck the water far below. It was a symbolic act of execution, an attempt to kill the father whose sins had now become his own. But he knew, even as he did it, that it was a futile gesture. The authority was gone, replaced by a gnawing existential doubt. If his father was a lie, what did that make him? If the foundations of his house were rotten, what did that mean for the man who lived within its walls? The mystery of Rachel had led him to the moral collapse of his lineage, but he was beginning to sense that the final, most terrible secret was yet to be revealed. He had cast his father's image into the abyss, not realizing that he was merely clearing the way for his own descent. The discovery of his father's crime, as profound as it was, did not bring Samuel Duval any closer to peace. It only deepened the mystery, twisting the riddle of Rachel into a shape that was becoming increasingly personal and monstrous. The hypothesis of a lost half-sister did not fully account for the chilling intimacy of her gaze, nor the way she had spoken his childhood name. The search, now fueled by a grief-stricken, paranoid energy, turned from his father's secrets to his mother's. He became convinced that the key to the final truth lay not with the perpetrator, but with the other primary victim of his father's betrayal. The first Eliza, the mistress of the house. His mother's belongings, which he had not touched since her death, were stored in a set of cedar trunks in the dust-choked attic. For 2 days, he sifted through the relics of her life, faded gowns, pressed flowers, bundles of letters from her family in Virginia. It was a journey into the world of a woman he remembered only as a gentle, melancholic figure, a woman whose sadness he now saw in a new, tragic light. He was looking for a diary, a letter, any mention of her handmaiden, but he found nothing. It was as if the girl Eliza had been systematically erased from his mother's history as well. The discovery, when it came, was accidental, a moment of pure serendipity that felt like a deliberate act of fate. He was about to abandon the search when he picked up his mother's old family Bible, a heavy, leather-bound volume with a tarnished silver clasp. As he held it, he felt a slight imbalance, a looseness in the thick back cover. Using a penknife, he pried at the edge. The leatherette cover, brittle with age, peeled back to reveal a shallow, hollowed-out compartment, a secret space no larger than the palm of his hand. Inside was not a letter but a small, folded piece of paper wrapped around 2 tiny locks of hair. His diary entry describing this moment is almost unreadable, the words scrawled and overlapping. He writes of the cold dread he felt as he untied the faded ribbon. 1 lock of hair was blonde, fine as corn silk, unmistakably his own from his infancy. The other was dark and curly, of a texture that was just as familiar, the hair of the enslaved girl who had served his mother. But it was the note, written in his mother's delicate looping script, that delivered the final fatal blow. It was not a lament for a wronged servant, it was a confession and a curse. The note was brief, its message devastatingly clear. It read, "He has sent my Eliza away. He does not know I carry his true heir. The other he cast into shadow. May God forgive this house." The date at the bottom was from the autumn of 1828, the same week that the girl, Eliza, had been sold. Samuel describes in his diary how he read the words over and over, his mind refusing to assemble them into their only possible monstrous meaning. The note was not about his father's child, it was about his mother's. Elias Duval had not impregnated the handmaiden. The handmaiden had known the truth about the mistress. The final, unthinkable truth crashed down upon him with the force of a physical collapse. Samuel Duval, the proud heir to the Duval name, was not Elias Duval's son. His mother had been having an affair, and he was the product of it. Elias, discovering the truth, had not cast out his wife, an act that would have brought public shame upon his house. Instead, in an act of calculated sociopathic revenge, he had allowed his wife's son to be raised as his own heir while selling away the one person who knew the secret, his wife's loyal handmaiden, Eliza. And in that moment, the entire mystery of Rachel was solved. She had not overheard his name. She had not been a servant in a neighboring house. She was not his half-sister. She was Eliza, his mother's handmaiden, the woman who had been sold into a living hell to protect the secret of his birth, the woman who had likely held him as an infant, who had perhaps even given him the nickname Sammy herself. The broken, silent woman he had brought back to Briarwood was not just a slave. She was his protector, his past, and in a way that defied all laws of God and man, she was the closest thing he had to a mother. The diary entry dissolves into a stream of consciousness, a mind breaking apart on the page. He wrote of the irony, the perfect, brutal symmetry of it all. He, the false heir, had inherited the house, the wealth, the power. And he had used that power to purchase, as a scientific specimen, the very woman whose suffering had been the price of his existence. He had brought the keeper of the secret back to the scene of the crime. The recognition in her eyes was not that of a slave for a master. It was the recognition of a woman for the child whose life had cost her own. The collapse was total and absolute. His entire life had been a lie. His name was not his own. His father was not his father. His very existence was the product of a hidden sin and a monstrous act of revenge. He was the true heir his mother had written of, but his inheritance was not Briarwood. It was this terrible, annihilating truth. He had sought to understand the broken woman in his house, only to discover that it was he who was truly broken, a man without a name, without a history, without a foundation. The experiment was over. The final data was in, and the conclusion was inescapable. In the aftermath of the Bible's revelation, the diary of Samuel Duval falls silent. The frantic, obsessive chronicling of his descent ceases abruptly. The narrative of his final days is pieced together not from his own words, but from a sworn testimony given weeks later by the overseer, Miller, to the Adams County Sheriff. This document, discovered alongside the diary in the courthouse cornerstone, provides a chilling third-person account of a man methodically preparing for his own erasure. The justification for his actions is not written down. It is inferred from the cold, deliberate nature of his final commands. According to Miller's testimony, on the morning of June 26th, 2 days after the last entry in the diary, Samuel Duval emerged from the main house for the first time in over a week. The overseer described his appearance as shocking. He was gaunt, unshaven, his eyes sunk deep into his skull, yet he moved with a strange, calm purpose that was more unsettling than his previous frantic energy. He was a man who had made a decision, a man who had passed through the inferno of his discovery and emerged on the other side into a cold, desolate peace. He had accepted the verdict of his history. He summoned Miller to the veranda and issued a series of clear, concise orders. All of the household staff, without exception, were to be dismissed from their duties immediately. They were to be given provisions for 3 days and instructed to remain in the slave quarters at the far end of the property. They were not, under any circumstances, to approach the main house until the morning of the 4th day. Miller, a man accustomed to the often unpredictable whims of his employer, was taken aback by the sheer finality of the command. He testified that he asked Samuel for a reason. Samuel's justification, as Miller reported it, was not an explanation, but a single cryptic command that hung in the humid Mississippi air like a death sentence. He looked not at Miller, but through him, his gaze fixed on some distant point in his own internal landscape. He said, "This house must be purified." The words were spoken without emotion, with the flat, dead tone of a man issuing a purely logistical order. Miller, sensing a line had been crossed, a threshold into a madness from which there was no return, did not press the matter further. He simply nodded and went to carry out the order. The testimony then describes the strange, silent exodus of the house staff. They gathered their meager belongings and filed out of the grand house that had been the center of their world, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and a dawning understanding that something terrible and final was about to occur. They looked back at the house, at the lone figure of their master standing on the veranda, watching them go. He did not wave. He did not speak. He simply stood, a statue of a man presiding over the dissolution of his own kingdom. The final part of Miller's account concerns the woman, Rachel. As the other slaves departed, she alone remained, standing near the great oak tree on the lawn, her usual still and silent self. Miller testified that he was unsure of what to do, as the master's order had been for all staff to depart. He approached Samuel and asked about the woman. Samuel turned his empty eyes toward her, and for a moment, a flicker of something, pain, pity, recognition passed across his face. Then it was gone. He said, "She is not staff. She is family. She will remain." This was his final recorded utterance. The overseer, now deeply unnerved, retreated with the others, leaving Samuel Duval and the woman who was his mother alone in the silent, empty house. The decision for his final decisive action was not justified in a letter or a diary entry. It was justified by his actions themselves. He was severing all ties to the world, creating a sealed, sacred space for his final reckoning. The purification he spoke of was not to be of the house, but of the history it contained, a history that now resided in two people, himself and the woman who was its source. The preparations were not for an escape or a confrontation. They were the preparations for a ritual. By dismissing the witnesses, he was taking sole ownership of the crime, the secret, and its consequences. He was not a man running from the truth. He was a man meticulously setting the stage to be consumed by it. The justification was not written because it was beyond words. It was an existential necessity, the only possible response to a truth that had rendered his entire life, his name, and his world a meaningless fiction. Miller's testimony concludes with him stating that on the third night, from the distant slave quarters, he saw a single lamp burning in the window of the master's study. It burned all through the night, a lone point of light in the vast, consuming darkness of Briarwood. It was a vigil kept by a man who was already a ghost, a man who had accepted his role as the final sacrificial payment for a debt he did not incur, but which had been returned to him in full. The last and most powerful primary source in the macabre case of Samuel Duval is not a diary or a letter filled with emotional revelation, but a cold forensic document, the official Adams County Coroner's Report, dated June 29, 1851. It is this report that provides the final, stark image of the tragedy, a tableau of silent, symbolic horror that speaks more loudly than any confession. The document, penned by a Dr. Alistair Finch, the same family name as the lawyer in Elias Duval's letters, details the scene discovered in the locked study at Briarwood on the morning the staff finally returned. The report begins by noting the state of the room. It was locked from the inside, the key still in the door. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no evidence of a forced entry. Everything was in its proper place, a room of perfect, undisturbed order, with one exception. Samuel Duval was seated in his high-backed leather chair behind his mahogany desk, dressed in his finest suit, as if prepared for a formal occasion. He was, the report states with clinical brevity, deceased. The cause of death was not immediately apparent. There were no wounds, no marks of violence upon his body. The true horror of the scene lay in the objects he clutched in his hands, held with a rigor mortis grip that the coroner noted was exceptionally strong. In his left hand, he held the bill of sale for the slave known as Rachel, the paper crumpled from the force of his grasp. It was the document that had begun his journey into the abyss, the record of his ownership over the woman whose existence had dismantled his own. It was a symbol of his power, his folly, and the terrible irony that had defined his final days. He had died, clinging to the proof of a relationship that was a lie. In his right hand, he held a single, folded piece of paper, a page torn from his own diary. The coroner, Dr. Finch, transcribed its contents directly into his report, preserving for posterity the final cryptic words of Samuel Duval. The note did not contain a confession, an apology, or an explanation. It contained a single chilling sentence, a final judgment on his life, his family, and the terrible history he had unearthed. The note read, "Some debts are not inherited, they are returned." It was a suicide note that was also an epitaph, a final verdict delivered from beyond the grave. The interpretation of this final scene is left to history, but its symbolic meaning is crushingly clear. Samuel Duval's death was not an act of despair, but a ritual of negation, a final, terrible balancing of the scales. By holding the bill of sale, he was acknowledging the crime of ownership, the lie that had structured his entire world. And with his final written words, he was articulating the terrifying karmic law that had governed his fate. The sin of his mother and the cruelty of the man he called his father had not been passed down to him as a burden to bear. It had been returned to him as a force of annihilation. The coroner's report continues with a detail that adds another layer of mystery to the scene. On the desk, placed neatly before the deceased, was a small silver locket, one that had belonged to his mother. The locket was open. On one side was a miniature portrait of Samuel as a child. The other side, which should have held a portrait of his father, was empty. The space was vacant, a void where a patriarch should have been. It was his final silent disavowal of the name Duval, a final declaration that he was the son of no one, the heir to nothing. The report concludes with a brief, almost perfunctory search for the woman, Rachel. The house was searched, the grounds were searched, but she was gone. She had vanished as silently as she had arrived, leaving behind no trace of her existence except for the devastating impact she had had on the master of the house. She was not a suspect. The locked room made that impossible. She was simply a catalyst, a ghost who had returned to deliver a message and then disappeared back into the shadows of history. The coroner's final determination of the cause of death was apoplexy brought on by a severe mental shock, a vague 19th century diagnosis that was a polite euphemism for a death that defied easy explanation. The true cause was not medical, it was existential. Samuel Duval had died, not from a failure of the body, but from a failure of the self, from the sudden, violent erasure of his entire perceived reality. The truth had not set him free. It had utterly and completely unmade him. This document, the final primary source, is the endpoint of Samuel's story. It is a portrait of a man who, having discovered he was a character in a fiction, chose to write his own final, terrible page. He did not fight, he did not flee, he did not seek justice. He simply accepted the logic of the horror he had uncovered and enacted its final, logical conclusion. The debt had been returned, and he was the payment. The silence that fell over Briarwood that morning was the silence of a story that had, at last, found its end. In the aftermath of Samuel Duval's death, the carefully constructed world of Briarwood Plantation dissolved with startling speed, its legacy becoming one of silence, debt, and deliberate forgetting. The consequences of Samuel's final, fatal discovery are not found in sensational newspaper articles or public trials, but in the dry, dispassionate records of commerce and law, documents that trace the methodical erasure of a great family's name from the landscape of Natchez. The grand house, once a symbol of power, became a monument to a secret that a community tacitly agreed to bury. The first documented consequence was the fate of the plantation itself. Within months of Samuel's death, his creditors, who had been held at bay by the family's formidable reputation, descended. It was discovered that Samuel, in his obsessive final weeks, had accrued massive debts, leveraging the plantation's assets to fund his frantic search through distant archives and land offices. Briarwood, its fields neglected and its operations in disarray, was declared insolvent. The entire estate, including its land, its assets, and its enslaved population, was broken up and sold at a public auction in the spring of 1852. The Duval name, once synonymous with wealth and influence, became a cautionary tale whispered in the parlors of Natchez. The family's distant cousins, who stood to inherit, found there was nothing left but debt and the faint, lingering stain of scandal. They quietly distanced themselves, allowing the name to fade from the rolls of the planter elite. Within a generation, the Duvals of Briarwood were little more than a memory, a ghost in the social history of the region. The house itself passed through a series of owners before being abandoned in the post-war economic collapse, its white columns slowly surrendering to the kudzu and the damp, indifferent passage of time. But the most significant legacy, and the most profound silence, concerns the woman known as Rachel, the woman whose true name was Eliza. In the chaos following Samuel's death, she vanished. She is not listed in the inventory of slaves sold at the Briarwood auction. She does not appear in any census records, any bills of sale, or any property documents from that period or any time after. She walked out of the locked room of Samuel Duval's life and into the complete and total anonymity of history. She was a ghost who had completed her task and returned to the shadows from whence she came. This official silence, however, is contrasted by a faint but persistent echo in the oral traditions of the region. In the 1930s, when interviewers for the Federal Writers Project collected the stories of formerly enslaved people in Mississippi, several accounts from the Natchez area spoke of a local legend. It was the story of the Silent Woman of Briarwood, a haint-like figure who, for years after the fall of the Duval house, was said to walk the old property lines at dusk. She never spoke, never interacted with anyone, but was simply a presence, a mournful guardian of a forgotten tragedy. These oral histories describe her not as a figure of terror, but as one of profound, impenetrable sorrow. One account, given by an elderly man whose grandparents had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation, claims that the woman was waiting for her boy to come home, a detail that, in light of Samuel's diary, is almost unbearably poignant. According to the legend, after several years of this silent vigil, she was seen walking toward the Mississippi River one evening and was never seen again. Whether she found a new life or simply an end to her long suffering is a question the historical record cannot answer. The legacy of Samuel Duval himself is one of almost complete erasure. He is remembered, if at all, as the last of his line, a strange, reclusive man who allowed a great family fortune to collapse into ruin. The true horrific reason for his demise was successfully suppressed, a dark secret that the Natchez elite, a society built on the careful maintenance of public facades, had no interest in preserving. The official story became one of a tragic, sudden fever, a narrative that protected the honor of the Duval name and buried the monstrous truth of its origins. And so, the legacy of this terrible family story is not one of justice or resolution, but of a profound and successful act of forgetting. The crime, the recognition, and the subsequent annihilation were all consumed by silence. The land itself became the only keeper of the secret. The ruins of Briarwood, which were finally torn down in the early 20th century to make way for a lumber mill, were said by locals to be a place of deep and abiding sadness, a place where the air was heavy with the weight of an unspoken grief. The diary, sealed in its tin box, remained the sole silent witness, waiting for a future generation to unearth it. Its eventual discovery in 1958 did not rewrite the history books or lead to a public reckoning. It simply added a dark, troubling footnote to the story of a fallen family, a whisper of the terrible personal apocalypse that had occurred behind the closed doors of a grand southern mansion. The consequences were not a change in the world, but the complete and total destruction of one man's world, a legacy of silence that is, perhaps, the most chilling outcome of all. The story of Samuel and Eliza, pieced together from the fragmented and long-buried evidence, resists easy categorization. It is not a tale of rebellion or a quest for justice in the traditional sense. It is something more elemental, a private, spiritual horror story that played out on the stage of American slavery. It is a testament to the fact that the greatest crimes of that institution were not just the public brutalities, but the silent, intimate destructions of family, identity, and the very concept of self. The case of Samuel Duval serves as a terrifying reminder that a history built on a foundation of lies will eventually demand a terrible reckoning. The most definitive act of erasure in this story came not in 1851, but in 1922, with the publication of The Great Families of the Natchez District, a comprehensive history of the region's planter aristocracy, written by a distant descendant of the Duval family. In the book, Samuel Duval's life is given a single, sanitized paragraph. He is described as a man of scholarly temperament whose promising life was cut tragically short by a sudden and virulent fever. There is no mention of a diary, a suicide, a cryptic note, or the woman who was the catalyst for it all. This official history is its own form of violence, a second, more permanent erasure of Eliza's existence. The historian's analysis of this case must therefore contend with two distinct narratives: the raw, experiential truth contained within Samuel's diary and the polished, protective fiction presented to the world. The gap between these two accounts is the space where the true horror of the story resides. It reveals a society so committed to preserving the illusion of honor and order that it would conspire, even across generations, to bury a truth that exposed the rot at its very core. The silence surrounding Samuel's death was not an accident. It was a deliberate, collective act of historical suppression. The central, open question that remains is the fate of Eliza. Did she, after a lifetime of trauma and erasure, find some measure of peace? Or was her entire existence, from her sale at 16 to her final disappearance, a long, unbroken chain of suffering? The historical record offers no answers, only the faint folkloric whispers of a silent woman walking a land that held both the memory of her child and the source of her pain. Her story is a microcosm of the millions of untold stories from that era, the lives of those who were systematically stripped of their names, their families, and their histories, leaving behind only a void in the official record. This case forces us to confront the nature of truth itself. For Samuel Duval, the truth was not a liberating force. It was a poison, a corrosive agent that dissolved the foundations of his reality and left him with nothing. His destruction poses a disturbing question. Are some truths so monstrous that they cannot be integrated into a human life? Is it possible for a revelation to be so profound that it negates the very consciousness that perceives it? The empty study at Briarwood stands as a silent, grim affirmative to this unsettling possibility. The artifacts of this case, the diary, the coroner's report, the bill of sale, now reside in the Mississippi State Archives, filed under Duval family papers. They are available to researchers, but they are rarely studied. They are a footnote in a larger history, a dark, uncomfortable cul-de-sac that most historians choose to pass by. The story is too personal, too strange, too resistant to being fit into the broader narratives of slavery and the Civil War. It remains an anomaly, a case that science and even history still cannot fully explain. And so, the final question is not what happened to Samuel Duval, but what the story of Samuel Duval means. It suggests that history is not a linear progression of events, but a living, breathing entity, and that the sins of the past do not simply fade away. They remain dormant and patient, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right word to be returned. The story of Briarwood is a warning that what we choose to bury does not die. It simply waits. The silence that fell over the Duval name was the silence of a successful cover-up, the silence of a history that had been conquered and rewritten by the powerful. But the silence of Eliza, the silent woman who walked the ruins of the plantation, was something else entirely. It was the silence of a truth that was too terrible to be spoken, but too powerful to be completely erased. And it is this silence that continues to haunt the landscape of the past, posing its own open and eternal question. When a truth is so monstrous that it destroys the one who uncovers it, what becomes of the truth itself? Does it vanish? Or does it simply wait in the darkness to be returned once more? The stories we think are over are never truly over. They exist in the margins, in the silences, in the documents that lie waiting in the dark. They remind us that history is not just a record of what happened, but a living presence that shapes our world, often in ways we refuse to see. The truth doesn't need us to believe in it. It only needs us to find it. If you believe that digging for these buried truths is a necessary act, subscribe to Before the Story. We don't just tell stories, we unearth them. Join us and let's see what else is waiting to be found.